Back. Today we're talking about the Mongol empires. Um, it's a bit longer of a lecture, but hopefully it won't be painful. I think it's a very interesting subject. One thing that makes the Mongol Empire interesting is the largest empire in history. That title doesn't go to the Romans, the Chinese. It was a relatively brief empire, but for a period in the 1200s AD or CE, uh, Genghis Khan, uh, you may have heard of Genghis Khan, same guy, ruled an empire that reached from the Pacific all the way to Eastern Europe, into India, into the Arabian Peninsula. Uh, huge empire. They defeated the Chinese, right? Completely took over China. Uh, they conquered parts of the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic empires. They all lost territory to the Mongol armies. And another impressive fact of this empire is that it didn't take centuries, right, to reach that extent as, for example, Rome did. Uh, this happened in a matter of decades. It was a quick flash, right? Around 70 years to all of a sudden become the largest empire in history and then to begin the collapse. Uh, so it wasn't as long lasting as the Romans, or certainly not as the Byzantines, but nonetheless, right, very interesting and prolific empire in its own right, and definitely worth uh, studying and understanding, especially if we were looking at the variety of empires and what makes certain empires work the way they do. Very, very different sort, huge and quick. Interesting to study and look into the reasons why that could be. So we've already encountered the people, right, that will uh, develop this huge Mongol empire under another name, right, the Xiongnu. So you may recall that, right, when the Qin had unified all the kingdoms under a single empire, and this is true, later dynasties, they were never completely at peace because there was more or less constant battles and skirmishes with nomadic, right, horseback warriors of the steppes, the plains. Um, as early as the 400s AD, you'll encounter these sorts of people. Attila the Hun may be a familiar name to you. Uh, he conquered large areas, even threatening Rome before finally turning back, right, before attempting to conquer Rome. But he was one of these people as well, these horse riding nomads. So the territory of these tribes consisted of steppes, forests, tundra, um, sort of stretched as far north as Finland, right into Scandinavia, butted up against the Chinese in the south and the Roman empires in the so yeah, I should have said west. The eastern bound would be so no one rides horses like nomad, and that gives them sort of automatic skill as war horseback. That's the fastest technology we have at the time, right? And so an entire army made up of these incredible riders would be a formidable military force. Uh, and they frequently, right? So even though, you know, for the Qin, they didn't constitute sort of another kingdom that needed to be uh, conquered. Um, they were nonetheless an important rival, right? That was constantly going on, and in part their lack of like a central capital, right, or central authority almost makes them more difficult to defeat, right? Because it's not like if you conquer one tribe, you've done away, right? They've surrendered and they become part of your territory. It's not like that. It's a very fluid enemy and thus very difficult to deal with, right? Um, but it wasn't just war uh, that was the mode of engagement, right, between the the people of the steppes and for example, the Chinese. There was also trade going on. Um, there were alliances made, right? Of course, those alliances were often easily broken, right? So, a winning strategy for a Mongol tribe would be to make right? Attack the Chinese, accept a settlement, right? Maybe do a little trading, and then just break that deal whenever it suited them, right? Because what they do, the again, these Mongols do not have a settled like central city or capital that the Chinese can come attack in retaliation. They can simply move on. In fact, that's their lifestyle, right? So yeah, it was a lucrative way of life and a difficult one, right, for settled empires. And as I said, a lot of trade, culture, technological innovation was passed, right, between uh, the nomadic peoples and these empires. Much of Chinese having encountered, right, these horseback warriors certainly would have adopted much of that technique as well for their own armies and so on with any sort of technological innovation. The Mongol lifestyle was a herding people, right? So they subsisted off of herd animals. They uh, were not agriculturalists, right? They did not plant crops. They had cattle, they had sheep, and the steppes, right? These plains and hilly areas were good for grazing, but the grass, if you took your animals to a certain part and had them graze, you couldn't stay there all year. The grass didn't grow back quickly enough, and so they became nomadic. So they would move, right, their herds from area to area, and they would graze on that. And they would survive off the milk, right, and the meat of these animals for the most part. So for herding, horses were essential, right? They were also very useful for war, and at a very young age, these Mongols become expert riders, and this becomes the core of their imposing military force. Uh, you could right? So obviously they could eat their animals, they could use them for leather, for clothing, to build shelters. Um, you could make an alcoholic drink from fermented milk, and even famously they would drink horse's blood, right? So if you were out of food and you're out on a military campaign, you could always make a little nick in the horse's veins, drink the blood. It wouldn't kill the horse, and you could fight another day. So they were able to subsist just off of their animals, right? They weren't opposed to having a little luxury now and then, right? And they would certainly trade with neighboring empires uh, for luxuries, technological improvements, and so they got iron tools, right, from interacting with the Chinese, tea, silk, and the Silk Road, right? The important trade routes ran through Mongol territory, right? And the Silk Road will play an important role in the later Mongol Empire. It is sort of the economic engine of the Mongol Empire, these important trade routes running from China all the way to the Middle East and Europe. So, being that these road ran through Mongol territory, they certainly had access to all of these luxuries and enhancements. They weren't uh, ignorant of right the rest of the world. They certainly could access. The nomad society was based on the tribe. The tribe was relatively small. It was based on family units, and it's about the size of a unit that could travel together from grazing area to grazing area as the seasons change. The larger the group, the more difficult it would be. But these tribes were in contact with each other, and alliances with other tribes was crucial to their success. There were a number of methods of creating these alliances. Marriage was one. So if your daughter marries someone from another tribe or vice versa, then those tribes become friendly and work together if there's a common enemy and so on. Another form of association was called sworn brotherhood. So even if there was no blood relation, again, family was sort of the core of this tribe. So if you wanted to join a tribe or join your two tribes together, you became sort of artificial family, right? brotherhood. So a sworn oath could make you a brother. Um, there were also sort of client relationships between smaller tribes and more powerful tribes. So you could sort of submit to another tribe and in return, right, get some protection from that larger, more powerful tribe. And take all those processes of association, repeat, 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 and you can get fairly large confederacies of tribes, right? And that's essentially how the Mongol Empire. All of the leaders of these Mongol empires will be called Khan. The term comes from the Turkish, and it implies a sort of mandate from the gods. So it is a sort of a religious term to denote, right, the gods sort of. The Mongols were a polytheistic people. So when we mean the gods, literally. The method of picking the Khan was sort of unique to Mongol society. So it wasn't a strictly patrilineal sort of situation. So a Khan dies, that doesn't mean that automatically the eldest son becomes Khan. Instead, they wanted to choose the best leader, and it wasn't sort of exactly a democratic process, but there's a limited uh, list of candidates, right, including the Khan's sons and maybe brothers and other close relatives. Then there would be a series of fights, negotiations, even assassinations, right, all sorts of maneuvering. Um, and that sort of maneuvering was essential to the process because it sort of revealed who would be the best leader, right? Who was going to be the most aggressive, the most clever, the most ruthless. And after that process continues for some period, then a committee would choose. Um, it was just their sort of most. You had to pick a top deity, right? Sort of Zeus of their who was Zeus to the Greeks, right? Was the father of all the gods, the head of all the gods. For the Mongols was Tengri, and again, my pronunciations are not perfect. A lot of this stuff. Um, certainly not the only deity, but it was kind of the greatest one. You also had shamans in Mongol. I think later in slides there's a picture of a more contemporary Mongol shaman, but they were like priests who could intercede with the gods and on behalf of the Khan. So shamans would be in sort of the inner circle of the leadership as kind of priests or means of contact with the gods. So various confederacies of tribes would dominate the area in which the Mongols operated at times, and the more powerful they were, the more they could profit off of the Silk Road. Uh, so again, yeah, Turkish tribes gave us the term Khan, and these Turkish tribes kind of dominated the area during the Sui and Tang dynasties of China. So this is about 581 to 900 AD. Later, the Uyghurs sort of cooperated with the Tang dynasty and gained prominence there. They were hired as soldiers, right? So the Chinese would, again, the Mongols were imposing uh, warriors, and so they were often hired as uh, hire for the various Chinese kingdoms that might be fighting each other, and so that could make you rich. And so the Uyghurs prospered for a while. Later, the Song dynasty allied with the Khitans road. So again, different confederacies of Mongol tribes would dominate at different times, often as a result of their alliance with the dominant Chinese dynasty. Uh, Genghis Khan's ancestors came from the north, and they were pushing against the Khitans, who were the dominant force at the time, around the early 1000s. They started, right? Genghis Khan's tribe started to emerge as a around the 1000, yeah, um, yeah, around 1000 AD. So Genghis Khan eventually became sort of the head, right, the Khan of the most dominant group at the time. We'll see more in a moment, a little bit more about his biography. Um, but his military system, right, of leading that tribe, that confederation of tribes, uh, he adopted and improved a traditional system, which is the decimal system of military units. So you had units of 10 men that would then be combined into units of 100, and then 1,000, and so on. Uh, One of his strategies is one that we've seen over and over in empires, to dismantle the traditional tribal units, right? So you have, you come to be leader, and there were you'll have competitors, right? There's families that were also prominent that were hoping that their sons or some member of their family would have become Khan, and so you or immediately have all these competing and powerful enemies within the tribe, and so something has to be done with them. And often what we see is we dismantle that traditional aristocratic system, scramble it all up, make it a meritocratic system, or at least right change the boundaries away from that traditional hierarchy, and that's exactly what Genghis Khan does as well. He reassembles people into units that are to be loyal to their unit and to the Khan, and not to their own particular family. Each soldier was made responsible for all the others in his unit. So if one soldier performs poorly, everyone gets punished, and this was a mechanism for keeping everyone. Uh, so training in mounted warfare happens from a young age. This is a contemporary, right, Mongolian little girl of about 3 or 4, looks like maybe a little older, with her bow and arrow on a horse. Right? From as soon as you were able to sit on a horse, you're riding and learning to hunt and to right, to fire, to use bow and arrow and so on. So they had this. There was a famous ability that the Mongol warriors had, which is they could ride in one direction and turn and shoot right in the other direction with the bow and arrow. Uh, so yeah, I think I've said very good horseback. There are also sort of more uh, tactics that were sort of more large scale. The Mongols were also excellent at, right? Which prominent among them was the fake retreat. So again, the whole the Mongols often couldn't, a single tribe, confederacy tribe, could not necessarily take down a Chinese army in sort of head combat. What they instead needed to do was draw the enemy out, right, and then slaughter them while they were not in formation, right. So accomplish that with deception, right. So you make it look like you're retreating, and then the enemy thinks, oh, it's a rout, right. We've beaten them. Now we need to just chase them down and decimate them. And so you draw them out with a fake retreat, and then you turn around, reassemble very quickly, and you're able to catch them off guard. The Mongol strategy. They use the compound bow as their primary weapon, which is composed of different materials, right, making it more powerful. And they also use gunpowder, right, whatever they were open to whatever technology they could find, and they certainly had access to it. Right? I mean, one important, very important part of their effectiveness as a military force is that they didn't have to worry about supply lines. They didn't have to worry that the soldiers were thinking of their farm at home, right, not being tended to, and their wives and their families. They were nomadic people, right? So if the campaign progressed from area to area, you brought your wife and your children and your herd with you. Warfare was just the way of life, right? Life was a military campaign. That campaign was your home, and there was no need for supply lines. You had everything you needed to live right there with your herd, and always some horse blood if you're in a pinch. So they could be at war all the time and didn't need to go home and sort of like get things in order. Okay, so a little more about Genghis Khan. So we haven't always focused on the personalities of particular rulers. You'll notice we didn't say a lot about Julius Caesar and so on. But Genghis Khan merits at least one slide to himself. Very interesting guy. So his biography supports this sort of traditional nomadic notion that Khan needs to be chosen by the gods, right? And in Chinggis's case, it's because his rise to power seems so improbable, right? The gods must have been involved. They must have picked him early on and made sure that he succeeded in this improbable event. So he was born to Temujin in a relatively unremarkable family, and then at a young age his father was killed, his tribe deserted him, and it was simply him and his mother foraging for food, eating roots, right? Completely destitute, probably destined for death very soon, right? But earlier on, he had married, right? And he had received a dowry when he married his wife. And so he used that little bit of money that he had to sort of buy his way into a tribe, right? Into the good graces of a clan leader. And he began to serve uh, that leader and rose in the ranks just due to his own intelligence, right? So he becomes, right, sort of the first stage of him revealing, right, who he would become is when his wife is kidnapped by another tribe. So he hunts this tribe down, defeats them, right, mercilessly slaughters them, gets his wife back, and sort of this story of his revenge, right, and his ruthlessness sort of cements his reputation, and riding on that reputation becomes the chief of his tribe. He then rises. He's later elected Khan of a large confederation of tribes. Uh, then did not go after the Chinese straight away. Right? That would be a bad idea. Instead, he allies with the Chinese Jin dynasty in order to fight competing tribes and to cement, right, his status as the biggest name, right, in Mongols, among the Mongols. So he definitely made use of these strategic retreats, right? Lots of clever field tactics, obviously a very good military mind. Um, Eventually, he becomes Khan of all the people of the steppes. He changes his name to Chinggis Khan. In 1206, we have a right more or less united Mongol uh, tribes, right, with Chinggis Khan. Again, as we said, right, he broke up the traditional nobility, these blood-based relations, these loyalties to anyone but him. He had to come down on those hard. So not only reorganizing the military, also murder, assassination, even of his own relatives, if he suspected his relatives of being of divided loyalties, right? The only loyalty had to be personal loyalty to him. And then in return, right, again, to cultivate this feeling of um, loyalty, he sort of had a man of the people image, right? So he would wear relatively common clothes. He would eat the common food, um, and cultivated, right, this relationship of everyone is personally loyal and personally beholden. So he had pretty much risen as far as he could among the Mongols, right? He was the leader of the Mongols, and so now he's starting to look to expand. This is where the empire starts to become an empire. So, with the tribes unified and his rule over the Mongols consolidated, right, Genghis Khan was looking for other places to expand, and China was the obvious target, right? It's a very nearby, very rich empire, and as we've seen, it's always sort of on the verge of fragmenting into separate kingdoms. So, at the time, the Song dynasty was dominating in the south, and then the Jin were in the north. But being the strategist that he was, Khan did not take on China just yet, right? Not until he was well prepared. So he was still subduing problem areas. There were some rebellious tribes up in Siberia and elsewhere. So once that was all settled and he didn't have to worry about people on the other side of his empire, he moved on the Jin and conquered their capital, which is near modern Beijing in 1215. So you can see that's sort of in the northern area there. So again, he stopped and didn't immediately move on the Song. In fact, he wasn't able to move on to the Song in his lifetime. Uh, but he paused and again sought to consolidate his empire and in particular to make sure that trade routes, right, the Silk Road that ran through his territory was secure and that um, he could make money off of it. Right? So he sent a messenger to the of Iran at the time to try to form an alliance with Iran, right, to help strengthen his position. But the Shah had the Mongol emissaries killed, which was bad news for that Shah, right, because Genghis Khan, being Genghis Khan, immediately retaliated, right, and invaded Central Asia instead. And so, if the Mongols conquered you, that was bad news for you. They basically leveled it, right? All the men were killed, women and children were taken as slaves, and anyone they thought might be useful, clergymen, again, they were polytheistic, so clergymen of any kind was useful to them. If you were an artisan with some particular skill, you were kidnapped, sent back to the Mongol Empire so that your skills could be of use to them. So before he could move on and finish his conquest of the Chinese empires, Genghis Khan died in a relatively minor battle. So he was always in there in the fray, right, fighting, and the risk of that is he would get killed. So he did get killed in 1226. So there's a lot of warfare going on, but it actually enabled an era of relative peace, a lot of trade, and a lot of prosperity for the Mongols and for anyone that was engaged in trade with the Mongols. So much of the conquest that was going on was meant to protect the trade routes that were the primary source of the empire's wealth. Uh, and so, sort of paradoxically, all this war enabled the peace, right? The source of the peace was this war. So Genghis Khan died, but he had already worked out a plan for his succession. The title of Khan went to his third son, but his other sons received other territories in various areas of the empire. And these sons immediately set to work and the empire, conquered their neighbors in Europe, Central Asia. And under his successor, his grandson, Kublai Khan, who you may also be a familiar name to you, the Song dynasty in the south in China was finally completed, was finally conquered. And you can see here in this GIF here the expansion of the Mongol Empire to become the largest empire in history. Right? In the west, another grandson pushed into Eastern Europe and Central Asia, conquering Baghdad. So at the end of it, by the middle of the 1200s, in an incredibly fast pace, right? Remember, this only begins in the beginning of the 1200s. We have the Mongol Empire dominating, right, that part of the world. So it wasn't just warfare that allowed for the prosperity and the success of the Mongols. They were skilled at diplomacy as well. So if you were sort of in the sights of Mongolian expansion, uh, having your city leveled was not the only option, right? Your other option would be to surrender and to cooperate with the Mongols, and this could be actually quite lucrative, rewarding strategy. And the Armenians chose that path. The Rus, who were the ancestors of the Russians, right, chose that path as well. Uh, and you could, become sort of a protectorate of the Mongol Empire. They would often, use some of the if you were sort of a rich person or an influential person and you surrendered, you could remain a rich and influential person just in service of the Mongols instead. Lots of people chose this path instead of just being murdered. Um, so eventually, the descendants of Genghis Khan formed sort of four distinct dynasties. Right, you have the Golden Horde in sort of the northwest, and the other khanates, right, in sort of the Middle East, one in sort of Central Asia, and then one basically of China. So by about 1260, there's not really a single Mongol empire anymore. It's more like Mongol empires, plural. So this transition from nomadic warriors, right, who being nomadic warriors were very successful at expansion, um, transition from that situation into now governing a large empire was not the most natural one. So one of the great Khans is quoted as saying, "The empire was created on horseback, but it cannot be governed on horseback." So now you have got the largest empire in history, you're going to need some help, right? You're going to need some intermediaries. This is the case with all the empires we've looked at. It's also going to require some flexibility, different styles of government in different areas. So in China, Kublai Khan declared himself emperor in 1272, and he adopted the title Yuan, which means roughly origin of the cosmos. This was a deliberate choice, right? So it sort of obscures his foreign origins, that he's not Chinese. Sort of also connects him to the mandate of heaven, right? Which was supposed to be what the Chinese emperors had. Having his origin in heaven, right? He's sort of saying, okay, I can be a Chinese emperor. Well, so you're governing this huge empire. Taxes need to be collected, and you need information about who's in your empire and what sort of taxes they owe. So you need a lot of demographic information, and a huge census was undertaken in 1252. We've seen similar things go on right in the Roman Empire. About 1,000 years earlier, they had to do a lot of census taking as well. So they divided the population according to the same system as the military, this decimal system, right, of groups of hundreds, groups of thousands, and then this mapped onto your military service. So everyone in the empire was required to serve in the military as well. The taxation system was varied. So for nomadic peoples, their herds were taxed. Landowning agricultural people, right, the land was taxed. People were taxed, slaves, and depending on the area, often the taxes were progressive. Wealthy people were taxed at a higher rate than less wealthy people. So taxation in particular requires intermediaries. You need tax collectors, right? Again, we don't have a sort of digital system where you can just file your taxes online and right, send a bank transfer. You need someone out there collecting all this currency and making sure that people pay, even when obvious that anyone's around to. You need a person around to say, hey, pay me your taxes, right? People aren't going to do it voluntarily. But the more intermediaries you use, as we've seen, there's always the danger of fragmentation, right? As they gain more power, they're going to want to maybe set up shop for themselves and not have to send them back to the Khan. So the Mongols were as paranoid about this as any empire would be, particularly the Chinese, and they addressed this issue in part by excluding non-Mongols from the military. So people could become officials, right, but they wouldn't be trained in combat. So effectively, right, the Khan was trying to monopolize organized violence. Only Mongols can do this, and hopefully to stave off the idea that some foreign official or intermediary would also put together a good sized army or an effective army and then attempt to break off by excluding them from the armies. Officials were often also shuffled or relocated, right? So we saw the Islamic doing this as well. And again, the aim is to break any local loyalties, them developing any power in a particular place, kidnap you, train you, station you somewhere else where you don't really have any connections or family. If you look like you're getting too powerful, we'll move you somewhere else, right? But the strategies varied according to the area. So the Chinese were excluded from government service entirely, right? Again, they would have been very paranoid, right, about the Chinese. They were their most powerful enemy. And so the fact that they were excluded from government service may have explained the flourishing of Chinese art and literature during this period. They weren't able to do occupation. They focused on art. So the Mongols were largely indifferent to religion, as we've seen has been the case in a lot of polytheistic empires. They're also, remember, history was largely tribal. Each tribe might have different gods, and the tribes often intermarried, formed different alliances, so they had to be pretty open to other people's gods if they weren't going to be totally isolated. This picture is of a Mongol shaman more recently. And a Mongol leader would happily convert to some other religion if it was convenient, right? So if he's in Christian territory and they want him to convert to Christianity, he'll do it. It was had a different meaning, right, for a Mongol, for a polytheistic Mongol, right, to convert to Christianity would often not be to assume that there was only one God. It was sort of assumed like, oh yeah, I'll tell this other God too, right? The most influential conversion was to Islam, and a good proportion of the Mongols did convert to Islam, and that became the majority in the late 1200s. So as loose as this Mongol rule could sometimes seem, coming from this sort of tribal background, there was a specific code of laws. It was designed by Genghis Khan. Unfortunately, we don't have that code anymore. It's sort of been lost to history, or maybe something will be discovered someday. But we lack a lot of the details of the legal system, unfortunately. But we do know that significant leeway was given to localities to this according to their own customs. You may recall a similar policy in Rome, right, where the Romans were covered by Roman law, but if you happen to be somewhere in Gaul, disputes among Gallic peoples could be settled according to their own laws. And a similar system was adopted by the Mongols in the far-flung areas of their empire. Um, trade routes is sort of the core project of the Mongol Empire, and they developed some strategies for that. So they had stations every 25 to 30 miles in a day on a horse. Um, each of these stations held like horses, supplies. They served as communication stations, taxation, right? Um, and in order to sort of access these services and check in, you needed a passport, which is this medallion that was inscribed. So this whole system of stations was called the YAM, and it coordinated the flow of goods and the flow of information throughout the empire, and is a fairly sophisticated method of sort of monitoring and allowing trade to flow. So all this trade, right, vastly changed the lifestyles of these nomadic people, right? So, these Mongols weren't drinking horse blood anymore. Um, they had wheat bread, right? Again, for non-agricultural people, wheat bread would be like a different sort of thing, right? A luxury. Pasta, almonds, pistachios, all the fruits of this far-flung empire that connects, you know, other empires and states beyond its borders through trade. You have a lot of flowing through, and the Mongols certainly afforded themselves with those. Arts and sciences also flourished under Mongol rule. You don't necessarily think of, right, the Genghis Khan as a scientist, but medicine, map making, astronomy, right, all developed in the Mongol Empire. Architecture, illustration, calligraphy, uh, carpet making, which was a very traditional art, developed also under the Mongol Empire. Here's an example of a Mongol carpet painting. So all of this was made possible by the fact that trade was so central to the Mongols. Right? As you'll recall that the Chinese sort of looked down on merchants, right? That an emperor was sort of disparaged for being descended from a merchant, right? They didn't have any of that prejudice. They just enjoyed all the benefits of the trade and all the merchants that were flowing through their empire. They also began a history of the world, right? Again, they were able to collect manuscripts from all over the empire and began to compile them into a single history. So, we said it was a relatively short-lived empire. We should spend a little time talking about the reasons for that. So, part of the military advantage of the Mongols came from their nomadic background. They were very, right, force warriors. Uh, but as they became settled, right, and they began to enjoy, wheat bread, right, for example, they lost the advantage of this mobility, and fragment fragmentation started to become attractive to the local leaders, right, as a method of gaining some power in addition to conquest of new territories. So we already saw that sort of the Genghis Khan's original empire had broken up into four large khanates by the 1300s, and those began to fall sort of one by one. So the Ilkhans in the Near East, from the Mamluks of Mamluks of Egypt, and then also the Mongols of the Golden Horde, sort of dynastic succession battles in China. They were under attack from other Mongol tribes in the north. In the south, there were peasant rebellions. So eventually, these Chinese territories returned to Chinese rule, right? And we had, of course, later Chinese dynasties lasting into the 1900s, right? Um, the Golden Horde, which was the Khanate in what is now Russia, broke up due to internal competition, and the other Central Asian Khanates also broke up. So eventually, fragmentation, splintering, the familiar story we see with many of these empires, particularly the ones in the area of China. There was a resurge of a Mongol empire under Tamerlane, right? He managed to revive a large proportion of the Mongol empire, um, and he pushed again back as far as Baghdad in India. In 1405 in an attempt to reconquer China. He was succeeded by his son, but that dynasty didn't last much longer. That was largely sort of like driven by his personality, and his successor not being as charismatic and was not really able to keep it together. So we're at 41 minutes. I'll end there, right? But I will check in Monday, and I'm just going to be talking about your paper and how to write your paper, and then there's a holiday after that. So next week is a relatively um, week lecture-wise, but do pay attention to that. The lecture I'm going to give on how to write a term paper. It is important for understanding what's going to be asked. All right, see you next time.